Hagströmer Lecture is a yearly event, and we're inviting an internationally renowned scholar to address a current topic of importance to medicine, healthcare, or life science, and to discuss this topic in a historical perspective. At the first Hagströmer Lecture in 2016, Professor Nathaniel Comfort from Johns Hopkins University addressed the gene editing tool CRISPR in relation to the history of genetics and eugenics. And last year, Nancy Toms gave a historical context to the notion of the informed patient and the consequences of digitally available information to doctor-patient interaction. This year, the topic is one of the most significant issues of our time. That is the health of humans and animals in relation to the health of our planet. Global health and sustainability are intertwined, and Karolinska Institutet addresses this pressing problem in its new vision and strategy statement. It has become necessary to approach health equity in relation to demography and social disparities, as well as climate change. The history of our institutions of scientific research and healthcare are also linked to social and political upheavals and epidemics. This becomes clear today when reflecting on the carnage of World War I and the concurrent devastating epidemic of the Spanish flu 100 years ago, exactly this year. To address the challenges ahead of us, it is crucial to have an understanding of their history. It is therefore a great pleasure for me to introduce to you Professor Warwick Anderson, one of the world's foremost historians of medicine and science. Warwick Anderson is an MD, PhD, and he is Janet Dora Hine Professor of Politics, Governance, and Ethics in the Department of History and the Charles Perkins Center at the University of Sydney. In 2018 to 19, he's also Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser Chair of Australian Studies in the Department of History of Science at Harvard University. The author of 4 prize-winning books in the history of modern science and medicine, including most recently with Ian R. McKay, Intolerant Bodies, A Short History of Autoimmunity, which came out in 2014. He is completing now a monograph on the history of 20th century disease ecology. The title of his talk is Global Health in the Anthropocene, History and Planetary Health. It was. It has changed. Okay. After the talk, there will be time for discussion, and it will be followed by a reception to which you are all invited. And without further ado, the floor is yours, Warwick.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eva, for that generous introduction. I feel a bit like a draft horse in harness with all these wires and cords, but I hope it helps matters. I hope this makes me slightly more audible there. Look, it's a real pleasure actually being in Stockholm for the first time and visiting the Karolinska Institute, as I understand, in effect, I'm doing. Many years ago, I was an intern on the clinical research unit of the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute in Melbourne, Australia, and that was one of the premier sites for the investigation of immunology and autoimmunity. And there were strong connections between the Karolinska and the Hall Institute, as I hope there still are. And so I've been hearing about the Karolinska for so many decades, so much admiration of the Karolinska. So it is a true delight to be here for this lecture. Now, I have changed the title. I think as time goes on, it may become clear, I hope it does, why I've done so. I realised increasingly that the Anthropocene was a sort of almost redundant category. It wasn't really my historical actors category. It was one that I'd imposed on them, but we could talk more about that later. So at the moment, I'm just saying planetary health history. And because this is very much for me a new project, I hope I'll crave your indulgence and I'll read, but I'll try to be as animated as an old draft horse like myself can be. Okay. So, far-reaching changes to the structure and function of the Earth's natural systems represent a growing threat to human health, reported the Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission on Planetary Health in 2015. During the past 200 years, rising standards of living attained through exploitation of the world's resources had led to improvements in global health and life expectancy. But the Commission warned that we have been mortgaging the health of future generations to realise economic and development goals or gains in the present. Accordingly, we now risk substantial health effects from the degradation of nature's life support systems in the future. Having sown the wind, we now would reap the whirlwind. Inefficient and unsustainable resource exploitation and technological fervour were bringing about climate change, ocean acidification, stratospheric ozone depletion, land degradation, water scarcity, species extinction, and biodiversity loss, all with the potential to harm the health of human populations. Yet contemporary modes of medical research and public health expertise did not adequately address this predicament. Therefore, the Commissioners proposed the concept of planetary health, based on what they said was the understanding that human health and human civilization depend on flourishing natural systems and the wise stewardship of those natural systems. The report's concern with marshalling environmental and epidemiological evidence, commitment to scaling up arguments, enthusiasm for systems thinking, and its prognostic, even proleptic inflection, epitomised the purposes and methods of the new planetary health movement. Since the late 1980s, a growing network of politically and environmentally aroused epidemiologists and public health activists, many of them located in Anglo-settler societies or associated with programs in tropical health and social medicine, had coalesced around what was perceived as the mutual imbrication of ecological sustainability and population health, human population health. Several of the authors of the Lancet report had been involved since the beginning of the campaign, before it was even called planetary health. Over the years, they had laboured to distinguish their viewpoint and approach from other proliferating, integrative and ambitious agenda in population health, such as global health, One Health and eco-health. In time, they were able to enlist the support of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Lancet and the Wellcome Trust. But what is the new planetary health they espouse? Or rather, what are the antecedents and the historical analogues and competitors of planetary health? And how may they have shaped what it is becoming? That land is a community is the basic concept of ecology. Conservationist Aldo Leopold wrote in 1949, but that land is to be loved and respected is an extension of ethics. Thus, some 60 years later, Tony Goldberg and Jonathan Patz, influential advocates of planetary health, posited a global health ethic premised on the idea of health as an interconnected entity, linking human health, animal health and environmental health, and possessing, they hoped, the wherewithal to impel sustained societal commitment. The invocation of Leopold suggests a deeper history of planetary health, a narrative that delves into 20th century disease ecology and environmental health, as well as post-World War II planetary thinking, including systems theory and cybernetics. Environment and climate have long offered appealing etiologies for human disease and suffering, but rarely, if ever, as systemically and globally as in planetary health. Although the ecological sensibility is hardly novel, the scale and span of the new frame for human population health extends further than ever before, and its world-making ambitions range far more widely. Historical analysis is needed to illuminate more clearly this strikingly new conceptual terrain. Planetary health may be regarded as the latest instalment in the centuries-long striving for biological complexity and ecological realism in epidemiological reasoning. In 1992, historian Charles Rosenberg distinguished between those medical researchers who try to work out what he called the configuration of epidemic disease, that is, its structural and relational dimensions, and those who, like conventional infectious disease experts, concentrated on contamination, the techniques of transmission of microorganisms or their proximate detection, microbe hunting in effect. He observed that throughout the 20th century, the configurational impulse, usually framed as disease ecology or social medicine, was never totally extinguished. It flared up again along with complex diseases such as influenza and AIDS, complicated natural phenomena that demanded similarly intricate biological or sociological explanation. The configurations that continued to excite general interest were predicated on strongly held assumptions about fit and stress, about balance and mismatch between humans and their environments. In the 21st century, planetary health is another such effort to reconfigure epidemiological reasoning. Concern about planetary health reflects long-standing anxieties about the deleterious consequences of civilization, the pathologies of progress. A serious attempt to understand the actual health effects of a collapse in the Earth's life systems, it is at the same time a convenient vehicle for the articulation of durable cultural recriminations. According to Rosenberg, unease about the risk of modern ways of life during the course of the 20th century was explained increasingly in terms not of the city as a pathogenic environment, but of evolutionary and global ecological realities. Artificial or unnatural environments have long excited fears that the fragile human organisms crowded into them might become unbalanced or overstressed, that the apprehension of human temerity and overreach has become a cultural commonplace makes it no less real, only perhaps more intelligible and apparent. Planetary health is the latest iteration of this integrative and inclusive narrative, the most recent crystallisation of our presentiment of the pathologies of progress, our discomposure in response to the perceived mismatch of body and environment. Thus, it represents a particularly pertinent and compelling argument for the reform of our contemporary pathogenic society. In the longer term and admittedly anthropocentric view of macro environmental degradation, the bottom line will be dominated by adverse effects upon human health and survival. So wrote Tony McMichael, the Australian epidemiologist, in 1991. A professor of occupational and environmental health at the University of Adelaide, McMichael had been shaken by the findings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the reports of the World Health Organization and the Australian National Health and Medical Research Council on the likely health consequences of the greenhouse effect, as it was called. All of them completed in the previous 12 months. Global ecosystems are today coming under threat from a resident species, he continued. This is a first in Earth's history. It is a dramatic development. Initially, McMichael adduced the greenhouse effect, ozone depletion, land degradation through soil erosion and salination, acid rain, loss of biodiversity, and contamination of soil and water with toxic agents. The health sector, he demanded, must lift its gaze to bigger ecological horizons. This will require a radical extension of the public health agenda, new forms of training in environmental health, a preparedness to base policy advice on predications and I think it might have been predictions and best guesses, as opposed to empirical data, and an ability to collaborate with unfamiliar disciplines, such as climatology and ecology. It meant, he wrote, that epidemiologists must anticipate the future. In subsequent warnings, McMichael reiterated the urgency of recognising an intimate relationship between the integrity of an ecosystem and the biological health and survival of its member species. His concerns expanded to include urban crowding and social disintegration, the results of the swarming, as he put it, of the human population, and its imprudent zeal for consumption. Additionally, he increasingly emphasised climate-induced shifts in the distribution of vector-borne infectious disease. The regenerative and absorptive capacity of the biosphere has its limits, McMichael wrote. Thresholds, once exceeded, may trigger unexpected events, as for the first time we push global ecosystems beyond their usually resilient limits. In the early 1990s, the epidemiologist was prolific in alerting the medical profession to the systematic overloading of the carrying capacity of the Earth's natural systems. He was quick to distinguish this global ecological menace from older medical geography and environmental toxicology. In contrast, the effects he now feared most were what he called the outcome of complex, feedback-rich, interactive disturbances of natural systems. In multiple articles and in his influential book, Planetary Overload in 1993, McMichael urged fellow epidemiologists to think within an ecological framework that relates population health to the environment's carrying capacity. Even as a medical student in Adelaide in the 1960s, McMichael had been attuned to the danger of environmental pollution, toxicity and deficit. As a radical university student leader, he read avidly Rachel Carson's distressing descriptions of the physiological and environmental effects of pesticides. Biologist Paul Ehrlich's Malthusian condemnation of the human population explosion, and the disease ecologist René Dubos's pleas to create resilient and supportive relations between humans and the earth they inhabit. These two influenced his thinking. As a young epidemiologist, McMichael went on to assess the health consequences of lead pollution, UV radiation, solvent exposure, alcohol consumption and passive smoking. His interest in the broader environmental causes of disease and debility did not solidify until back in Adelaide in the late 1980s. Soon after, the terms ecosystem, biosphere, carrying capacity, overload and sustainability punctuated his texts, as we've seen. Appointed Professor of Epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in 1994, McMichael soon encountered other medical scientists speculating on the ramifications of global environmental degradation. Since 1990, epidemiologist Andrew Haynes had been exhorting British public health experts to address the implications for health of global warming. Once active in International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, he was increasingly concerned that the overheating of the Earth would lead to rising sea levels and encroachment on arable land, deadly heat waves, widespread respiratory disease, and the proliferation and spread of the insect vectors of pathogens. Before long, Haynes and McMichael were collaborating in warning of the health consequences of global ecosystem degeneration. Anthropogenic climate change signifies that for the first time, the aggregate global impact of humankind exceeds the physical and ecological limits of the biosphere, they wrote in 1997. This greatly extends the temporo-spatial scale of environmental health beyond our usual concern with localised and immediate exposures to toxic or infectious agents. Within a few years, Haynes became the director of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, while McMichael returned to Australia to head the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health at the Australian National University, consolidating London and Canberra as principal sites for the development of what would be called planetary health. At the beginning of the 21st century, Richard Horton, the editor of the Lancet, offered his journal as a vehicle for the provocative project. Accordingly, McMichael and Haynes were deluging its readers with remonstrations against the effects of climate change and ecological degradation. We are at a substantive, not merely a millennial crossroads, McMichael wrote in one of these pieces. Into the 21st century, McMichael continued to attempt to alert the public and policymakers to the urgency of climate change, environmental degradation and loss of biodiversity. His book, Climate Change and the Health of Nations, published posthumously in 2017, expatiated on the risks anthropogenic climate change posed to human health and physical survival. McMichael, in this book, began to engage with arguments about the Anthropocene quite directly and about humans as geological agents, though to an extent these ideas were redundant to his thesis. He'd recognised the civilisational challenge to the biosphere's ecosystems long before the epoch was named. He agreed too that the disordered relationship between humans and the rest of the natural world would mean that a number of critical planetary boundaries had already been crossed, and soon more would be transgressed. To ensure operating space on the planet for future generations, he wrote, the global population must reduce the excessive pressures on the global environment. Although a relatively elastic category, planetary health quickly gained form and density in the early 21st century. In 2010, the Rockefeller Foundation joined the Lancet in supporting what it called a new health discipline, Public Health 2.0. Foundation President Judith Rodin believed planetary health went beyond the boundaries of our existing global health frameworks to take into consideration the natural systems upon which human health depends. The Foundation set up health and ecosystems analysis of linkages, HEAL, H-E-A-L, which later morphed into the Planetary Health Alliance. The ensuing Rockefeller Foundation Lancet Commission met at Bellagio in July 2014 and issued its influential report on the enfeebled condition of the Earth's natural systems the following year. In 2015, the Wellcome Trust also enrolled in the project, launching a new priority area for funding, Our Planet, Our Health, focusing on the health effects of climate change, urban environments, and challenges to food systems. International journals Lancet Planetary Health and the American Geophysical Union's GeoHealth were established in 2017, and Nature Sustainability began publishing in 2018. As planetary health networks extended, the epidemiological research agenda took shape. A new career path emerged in public health, and topical opportunities for shaping policy unfolded. but the nascent field of inquiry still seemed more effective in diagnosing planetary afflictions and sounding alarms than in proposing realistic or pragmatic solutions. The scale of the problem demanded far-reaching and ambitious changes in the relations of human populations to the planet they inhabit, a reconstitution of the world that might be necessary but not readily achievable. Nonetheless, the new experts in planetary health hopefully joined the chorus beseeching world leaders to work for sustainable societies and intergenerational equity, to control human population growth, eliminate fossil fuels, and stop polluting the land, air, rivers, and oceans. In linking human health to ecological imperatives, they hope to add force and precision to these entreaties. Planetary health was seeking a niche in the dense ecology of global health, which had flourished and matured since the 1980s, as the national and international health services declined. The additional field often provided a refuge for environmental health activists disappointed with what they regarded as the narrow instrumentalism and disease specificity of conventional global health interventions. The commitment of such insurgent advocates to the health of planetary natural systems appeared to operate in a different register from global health's particular concerns with biosecurity, humanitarianism, and economy. Even at the same time as they shared an absorption in patterns of disease emergence on the world stage. Global health experts had rapidly developed a worldwide system of epidemic intelligence and a repertoire of vertically organised, technocratic and transposable disease control programs, whereas planetary health leaders were aspiring to saving the Earth's life support systems. In comparison, a lofty, perhaps even quixotic goal. Few imagined then that planetary health could substitute for global health, but many thought it offered an indispensable supplement or extension. It is important to distinguish also planetary health from other alternatives to global health, or at least from alternative integrative blueprints for global health, which also emerged in the early 21st century. One Health, for example, emphasised the linkages between human health, other animal health, and environmental conditions, searching for animal reservoirs for infectious diseases and studying the health effects of the distribution, abundance, and interaction of human and other animal populations, usually vertebrates. It represented in practice the convergence of veterinary and human medicine. Eco-health sprang up around 2004, similarly dedicated to explaining connections between the health of all species and their ecosystems, while concentrating on biodiversity and sustainability more generally. Currently, planetary health, One Health, and eco-health thrive together in the entangled bank as edge effects of global health. There is considerable crossover between them, even overlap, though planetary health, as its name suggests, tends boldly to assume a more capacious and sweeping scale and engage more intimately with systems ecology, about which I want to speak now. In 2015, the year after McMichael's death, Stephen Boyden recalled that the epidemiologist had discussed human health against the background of the story of life on Earth and our own evolutionary history. For decades, Boyden, by then an elderly biologist at the Australian National University, had promoted what he called a biohistorical perspective, very similar to what he saw McMichael doing. Steve Boyden is still an active researcher at the age of 94 in Canberra. His research was shaping McMichael's thinking on environmental health even in the early 1980s. As a young trailblazer in immunology in the 1950s, Boyden, who'd trained as a veterinarian in London, had worked with René Dubos, of whom more later, in New York, and then with Frank Fenner in Canberra. Through these mentors, he acquired a compelling interest in human ecology, and so In the 1970s, he followed Fenner to the Centre for Resource and Environmental Studies across the ANU campus, thus abandoning immunology. While the original research of Dubos and Fenner had focused on the ecology of infectious diseases, that is, the interplay of parasites and hosts, Boyden concentrated from the beginning on the direct effects on human health of changes in the physical environment. In 1972, he warned that trends in the relationship between human society and the total environment constitute a serious threat to the survival of civilization and mankind. He worried especially about the galloping techno-demographic processes which threaten the integrity of the biosphere. The biosphere is the word he used, including air and water pollution, contamination with pesticides, and overcrowding in urban communities. Following the introduction of fossil fuels, he wrote, the integrity of the biosphere as a whole is now considered by many ecologists to be in jeopardy. The rate of energy flow, the rate of energy flow through human society is accelerating rapidly. Adapted to a different environment, humans faced a catastrophic phylogenetically determined maladjustment, that's his phrase, phylogenetically determined maladjustment once living conditions deviated. For decades, Boyden continued to issue jeremiads against the pathologies of progress from Canberra, but until McMichael took up his postulations in the 1990s, few heeded his counsel. Boyden's work explicitly connects emergent planetary health with a longer tradition of ecological thought in 20th century biomedicine. A term coined in the 1930s by Australian virologist Macfarlane Burnett, disease ecology signified reconceptualising infectious disease as the outcome of competition, at the time anyhow, as the outcome of competition between hosts and parasites, specifically as a struggle for existence between humans and microbes. Burnett's reading of the work of animal ecologists A.J. Nicholson and Charles Elton led him to believe that in a constant environment, the co-evolution of host resistance and parasite virulence would achieve an equilibrium between organisms. But with civilization and progress came crowding, social disruption, and enhanced communication, giving rise to epidemic outbreaks. After World War II, Frank Fenner, who was a protege of both Burnett and Dubos, he'd worked with both Burnett in Melbourne and Dubos in New York, took the study of disease ecology in a new direction. Along with zoologist and conservationist Francis Radcliffe, he modelled statistically the rapid co-evolution of host resistance and viral virulence when myxomatosis was introduced into Australia's teeming rabbit populations. Unlike Burnett, Fenner, who was the son of a geographer, allowed a greater role for the impact of the physical environment and the weather on the distribution and abundance of the organisms he was tracking. Fenner observed closely local debates between population ecologists in Australia, especially the intense conflict that pitted density-dependent theorists such as Nicholson, who stressed competition amongst organisms, against those like Charles Birch and Herbert Andrewartha, who argued for environmental controls on animal populations and highlighted natural selection. By factoring the contribution of the physical environment into disease ecology, and thus following Birch and Andrewartha, Fenner and his colleagues became more sympathetic to the older and supposedly outmoded etiological claims of medical geography, which had connected human health to place and circumstance. At the same time, their ecological orientation made them far more expansive and integrative and less bounded and reductive than lingering 20th century medical geographers like Edgar Seidenstricker and Jacques May. Dubos, however, would prove the major formative influence on both Boyden and McMichael, and hence on emerging planetary health. Trained as an agricultural scientist in France, Dubos collaborated with Selman Waxman in studies of soil microbiology before moving to the Rockefeller Institute, up the road really, from New Jersey to the Rockefeller Institute in New York City, where he isolated gramicidin, a topical antibiotic. As a microbiologist, Dubos continued to demonstrate a distinctively French fascination with terroir and milieu, prompted perhaps by nostalgia for the imagined harmonies of rural existence. From the 1940s, inspired by his readings of Macfarlane Burnet, he began to inquire into evolutionary aspects of bacterial existence, seeking to elaborate on the natural history of agents of infectious disease. After the war, Dubos discovered a knack for writing popular books on medical and ecological themes. In Mirage of Health in 1959, he recommended the peaceful coexistence of humans and microbes, suggesting we might focus on mutualism and symbiosis, and decrying technological fixes and medical utopias. His emphasis on the harmony of the organism and its environment would become increasingly Hippocratic and less Darwinian. Appearing in 1965, his next book, Man Adapting, soon became an international bestseller and a touchstone for Boyden and McMichael. Dubos proposed that the states of health and disease are expressions of the success or failure of the organism to respond adaptively to environmental challenges. Our contemporary predicament was that modern man has retained unaltered the bodily constitution, physiological responses and emotional drives which he has inherited from his Paleolithic ancestors, yet he lives in a mechanised, air-conditioned and regimented world radically different from the one in which he evolved. Dubos's vehement condemnation of the pathology of urban and suburban life, of anti-physiological leisure in a mechanised, automated and crowded environment, appealed to the protest movements of the 1960s, making him a hero of the counterculture. In 1968, Dubos further amplified his warnings of the dark side of civilization and progress. All natural phenomena, he wrote, are the results of complex interrelationships. All manifestations of human disease are the consequences of the interplay between body, mind, and environment. He deplored the damage that global industrial capitalism was doing to our ecosystems, our bodies, and to human values. Medical problems posed by the environmental stimuli and insults of modern civilization have acquired a critical urgency, he asserted. In distant Australia, Boyden and McMichael seemed to be hanging on his every word. During the Cold War, Dubos came to think globally, even when not acting locally. For more than a century, imperial expansion, enhanced communications, and the spread of epidemic disease, such as the 1919 influenza pandemic, had been making the planet imaginable as a whole. The recent World War and subsequent prospect of nuclear annihilation made visible as never before planetary interconnections and dependencies. Post-war internationalism conjured up a sense of a single community of nations and peoples. After the war, fears of the human population explosion and excessive consumption of the Earth's finite resources became ever more pressing. In 1948, New York conservationist Fairfield Osborn published Our Plundered Planet, lamenting our poor stewardship of the whole Earth. The Earth is constantly becoming smaller, or rather our knowledge of it is leading us to think of it as diminishing rapidly, he wrote. The same year, American ornithologist William Vogt, in Road to Survival, pessimistically estimated the planet's human carrying capacity, the term he popularised, warning of imminent environmental overload. Humans were destroying the environment indispensable to their survival. They had backed themselves into an ecological trap. Post-war Malthusianism would culminate in Paul Ehrlich's alarmist The Population Bomb in 1968, which prophesied massive starvation and misery as exponential human population growth outpaced food production. The impression of planetary overload came to weigh heavily on Dubos. From the 1960s, as the Apollo space mission was broadcasting stunning images of the planet as a spinning blue marble, brittle and isolated in the cosmos, environmentalists began to refer to spaceship Earth. British economist and journalist Barbara Ward probably first used the locution in 1966 in her book Promoting Sustainable Development. The same year, proponent of evolutionary economics, Kenneth Boulding, suggested we regard the Earth as a closed system, like a spaceship. The closed economy of the future, he wrote, might be called the spaceman economy, in which the Earth has become a single spaceship without unlimited reservoirs of anything, either for extraction or for pollution, and in which, therefore, man must find his place in a cyclical ecological system. Designer and systems theorist Buckminster Fuller, a few years later, expressed his concerns about environmental sustainability in Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. In 1972, Dubos and Ward collaborated on their book, Only One Earth, The Care and Maintenance of a Small Planet, which extensively documented the harm that humans were doing to the planet's unified life support system. By the 1980s then, a planetary environmental consciousness was well established, though its articulation with human health was still ambiguous or speculative. Boyden and McMichael always insisted on thinking systemically and on resisting simple organic analogies and linear reasoning. Concepts of biosphere and ecosystem carried special significance for them, more than for the previous generation of disease ecologists. In 1935, British plant ecologist Arthur Tansley had coined the term ecosystem in a casual reference to transfers between organisms and their environment. During the 1940s, Evelyn Hutchinson, a limnologist at Yale, elaborated on the notion of circular causal systems, arguing that groups of organisms might be acted upon by their environment and they may react upon it, he wrote. Such circular paths were self-correcting within limits, but could break down into violent oscillations when some variable transgressed safe values. Hutchinson was attempting to integrate Ludwig von Bertalanffy's general system laws and Norbert Wiener's theory of cybernetics with the concept of the biosphere, as developed in the 1920s by Russian geochemist Vladimir Vernadsky. For Vernadsky, the biosphere, or interactive biological life, was a force transforming the geosphere, inanimate matter, often on a planetary scale. Hutchinson and his students tried to restructure ecology in relation to systems theory, cybernetics, and ideas about the biosphere, scaling up from lakes to the Earth as a whole and substituting system for older organic analogy and Hippocratic assumption. Thus, Raymond Lindemann in 1942 could describe what he called the ecosystem of a lake as a system of energy flows or energy availing relationships. Furthermore, he believes such an ecosystem is the system composed of physical, chemical, biological processes active within a space-time unit of any magnitude. In the 1950s, Howard Odum and his brother Eugene Odum, students of Hutchinson, would expand on the new systems ecology, describing large cyclical entities or energetic systems, and venturing to make predictive generalizations which could encompass the planet. And so, eventually, environmentally sensitive biomedical scientists such as Boyden and McMichael, among others, might recognise system modelling and planetary thinking, shorn of Cold War technocratic optimism, as resources for reframing and rescaling disease ecology, and thus they created planetary health. So, to conclude, all ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise. Aldo Leopold reflected in the 1940s that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. In this sense, advocates of planetary health in the early 21st century were proposing a whole earth ethic, not simply a land ethic. Its boundaries would be planetary, not circumscribed by niche or nation. Drawing intellectual resources and practical insights from systems ecology, medical geography, and planetary sensibility, they were fashioning wide-ranging and ambitious theories of the connections between humans, other animals, and the Earth's environment or biosphere. As it was emerging, planetary health thus differed in scale, scope, and span from ordinary global health and from its rivals, One Health and EcoHealth. Another effort to render epidemiological calculations more complex and complete, in effect more ecological. The new planetary health additionally was reformulating long-standing concerns about the impact of civilization on human bodies and minds, reshaping time-worn narratives of the pathologies of progress and the perils of alienation from natural systems. As a new configuration of epidemiological reasoning, planetary health implies a different historicity or tempo from other styles of understanding patterns and causes of disease. Distinct from the proximate and sequential timeframes of simpler contamination models, that is of microbe hunting, planetary health involves more complex and naturalised temporal schemas, whether evolutionary, ecological or geological. Planetary health operates on an unprecedented scale and over an extended span, and yet, as a technology of anticipation, it implies outcomes nearby and imminent within our short lifetimes. Arising at a moment of rare historical self-consciousness among our species, it tracks the longue durée or deep time, while still oriented toward or anticipating the immediate future of the planet and its life forms. Though its own history so far is short, there is potentially more history in planetary health than in any other mode of epidemiological timekeeping. Assumptions of this kind about temporality influence our evaluation of the challenges we face, and equally they will structure recommendations and interventions. Finally, the seeds of modern conservationism, according to environmental historian Richard Grove, developed as an integral part of the European encounter with the tropics. While Tom Griffiths and Libby Robin have shown how, in a later period, ecology developed primarily on settler colonial borderlands and at the edge of empire as a kind of border biology, Robert Kohler may say. A settler society, whether or not numerically dominant, Griffiths writes, was an invading, investing, transforming society with an internal frontier, both natural and cultural. Accordingly, for settlers, ecology and empire represented the competing realities of geography and history, land and culture, and stood for a fundamental, persistent tension between origins and environment. Ecology, thus, was one of what Libby Robin calls the sciences of settling. Planetary health, like disease ecology, emerged late as a settler colonial and imperial formation, based in centres like Boston, Canberra and London, and revealing anxieties and premonitions about the relations of different human groups and other animals to the territories, often inhospitable, that they occupy as Neo-Europes. How, we may ask, will planetary health evolve when situated in the planet's other intellectual and institutional niches? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see if this is on here. Thank you so much for a terrific talk, Warwick. It was really interesting. And if we can get this microphone to work, we will also be able to send that out in the audience. And please think of any questions. You will have time. And I already see 2 people up here. Any more? Okay.
I don't want to impinge on the reception, but we did start 10 minutes late.
No,
so
you're here, so we should take the advantage. All right, I think we shall just skip the microphone since we're operating with a new system that might not be happy today. So please, Ole Petter.
Well, as the president of Karolinska Institutet and as a total non-expert in this field, perhaps I could ask a question.
Yes, please do.
First of all, it's great to see you here, by the way. But when you talked about this fascinating interplay between medicine, history, global health, and so forth, leading up to the concept planetary health, you started off in fairly recent history. I remember a few years ago, I went to the Yucatan Peninsula, and we heard, fact or myth, that the native Indians had a pretty good grasp of the necessity to live sustainably. So the question is, did the native Indians and other indigenous populations, did they really precede the more modern society when it comes to this very important understanding?
I think you've drawn attention to a very important issue, and that is the role of indigenous knowledge in the formulation of not only planetary health, but indeed eco-health and One Health and so on. And one would hope global health, but that seems to have become so modular and insular that it would be harder to discern any impact in that field, I suspect. But no, this is a pressing issue, and I think it's been recognised in eco-health for at least 5 or 6 years. People have been writing about the importance of indigenous knowledge to eco-health. And I think just in the last year or two, people within the field of planetary health, as it's emerging, it is still somewhat inchoate, which makes it exciting as well, because it's one of those fields that a lot of people could influence and shape at this point. But in particular, I think there is a sense that we need to, people in planetary health need to engage with indigenous knowledge. Now, I think one of the potential resistances is going to be how to integrate indigenous knowledges and systems ecology. The systems thinking itself has become so sort of autonomous of other arguments that it's going to be very hard to see how it can be modified. But you've pointed to a serious issue, and my concluding sentence was, how will planetary health evolve in other intellectual and institutional niches? And I don't just mean the Karolinska Institute. I do also mean when actually engaging with indigenous knowledge spaces as well. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. That is indeed a really important question. And thank you, Petter. And Ingemar,
so my name is Ingemar Ernberg. I have not a past, I think I have a presence in infection, immunology and cancer, but I'm completely ignorant in planetary health, and it was fascinating to get your perspective of sciences that I have sort of touched upon. And many references in your talk, like Frank Fenner, McFarlane Burnett, Paul Ehrlich, René Dubos, have sort of been heroes and to the roots of what I have been working on. But I have sort of a little bit in the popular science domain met concepts like which were called planetary health, but which dealt with this. And I was curious where you would put people like Jerry Diamond,
yes,
which to me was an eye-opener when I read his Guns, Germs and Steel. Is he not a scientist? I mean, why isn't he in your list? Where does he come up? Because he actually did really.
Yes.
And another one which I am less in favor of, but which was very famous in my generation and my more revolutionary friends was Lovelock and the Gaia movement. So would you like to comment on these two?
Yes, the reason I haven't emphasised Diamond, I mean, Diamond is there in the. If you want to look at the historical background of development of contemporary concepts of planetary health, Diamond is there. He's mentioned a fair bit. Boyden refers to him. McMichael refers to him, but he doesn't seem to be a really formative influence. He's there, I think, in a sense, endorsing what they've found out from others. They admire him, but I don't think they found him to be as formative as many of the others whom I've mentioned. I did, of necessity, leave out a lot. There are many others I could have talked about too, Barry Commoner and a whole lot of that.
Of course, Diamond's Guns, Germs and Steel,
yeah.
and then this next one, a thick volume, The Collapse.
Yeah, but a lot of this was happening.
He really addresses these issues.
Yeah, but a lot of this was happening before that.
Facts,
yeah, and one could actually include those sort of more ecological, or at least epidemiological historians like Crosby and McNeill as well, and they also are referred to, but usually they're referred to as just supporting evidence rather than people who've really shaped the argument for these people, because a lot of this was happening before Diamond became well known anyhow. But the Gaia hypothesis is much more complex, and Sverker Sörlin may actually have more to say on this, but it's remarkable the extent to which it's ignored. Its absence is, I think, probably very telling. And they really, everyone avoids it completely. Yeah, yeah. And it is. I've looked through a lot of read through a lot of this material, but not completely before I put together this talk, looking for Gaia, and I just couldn't find it. I'm not saying it's not there, but I just couldn't find it.
Should it be avoided?
Yes. Well, I'm an historian, so it is avoided.
If it's not there, it's not
avoided. It is avoided. But the question, I suppose, is why is it avoided? And I think one of the problems, at least in some of the early there are lots of formulations of Gaia, and I still haven't completely worked out, say, Bruno Latour's latest version and so on. But a lot of the earlier ones do emphasise the self-regulating system, and it doesn't fit with an argument that we've gone beyond those limits and everything's out of control. And so I think that there's a sense that Gaia may be too reassuring for people and disarm people in a way. So and so I think that's probably why there's no reference to it. Yeah, but it is worth thinking about and contemplating. Yeah.
It's actually, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions over here. Sergio first.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting that well, thanks for a great talk to begin with. So it makes you really take off in many directions. I actually met Lovelock. I'm not sure many here who did actually meet him. That was in Oslo maybe 10, 12 years ago on an occasion where Arne Næss, the famous philosopher at Oslo University, was really the centerpiece of the interest. He was very old by then. And I think one of the reasons that Lovelock was never really fully taken on board in many circles was the way he sort of refers to the Earth as a self-regulatory system in a pretty harsh way. You know, if there are a few billions too many, guy would shrug them off our shoulders. And Lovelock's own take on this was, of course, that this was just fine. And by the way, England is full already of people, so very good that we, and so on. And I even noticed...
But speaking of what puzzles me, they do take up Ehrlich, though.
They do.
Who had a similar sort of...
yeah, but I think he was
Malthusian.
sort of a neo-Malthusian within limits, at least. There was something boundless with the cybernetics of Lovelock. I wanted to actually go back to your very, very first words about yourself and your work in Melbourne and in relation to Karolinska Institute. Because in this sweep, one couldn't help notice that there was at least there was really one major geographical focus, which actually was in Australia.
Yes.
There were quite a number of people there actually, and Stephen Boyden, I met him back in the 80s already the first time, and he worked on cities too. So epidemics in cities, his work on Hong Kong is
urban ecology of Hong Kong.
Exactly. And then you mentioned people from the United States, from the UK, and a few other places. But actually, you didn't touch enough on Stockholm, I would say, and I would invite you to reflect a little bit on that, because some of all these tendencies were brought into the UN conference in 1972, and certainly all the kinds of thinking around the IPCC with Bert Molin, the meteorologists here, people working in epidemiology, people working in biology, ecology, and several other fields. And I think the more we look under the lid of Stockholm, we see that you were perfectly spot on when you related Melbourne and Australian work to Stockholm. But not to make it too complex to you, I would like to ask you about Australia. What might be the reason that so many people in that part of the world seem to have a relevant contribution to this very complex area?
Yes, well, thank you for that question. And as you'll find out eventually in the longer version of the paper, I actually do refer to a number of Stockholm conferences, and which I think, and a lot of these people contributed to reports associated with those conferences too, especially in the later period. But and even in there's a footnote somewhere about in 1992, the WHO had a report called "Our Planet, Our Health," which the title was more promising than the actual content, but they were obviously thinking along those lines in Geneva as well. And so I think there is more to be said about that. And the other, also a longer version of this, which would have kept us here until 10 p.m. at least, has a section about the failure of planetary health to take off in the Boston area, where there was a group of radical physicians, Bernard Lown, Alexander Leaf, Eric Chivian, Paul Epstein, who were aroused by concerns about potential nuclear catastrophe, who in the late 80s started to write more generally about degradation of natural systems. But then it's controversial. No one wants to talk about it even now around Harvard, because it became very bitter between those people who wanted to stay focused on nuclear war and others who wanted to go off and think about the planet's ecosystems. And in the end, it all just collapsed in personal bitterness, which is an interesting contrast. Recently, Harvard has started up a new program in planetary health, led by a student of Jonathan, or a protege of Jonathan Patz, who's coming from an ecological background, and he's the leader of the Planetary Health Alliance, Sam Myers. So there are other stories. Some successful, some not. But I think if you look at the patterns of citation and so on, for the contemporary, or the last 5 years, of planetary health literature, the people I've focused on are the key figures. Now, why are they the key figures? I think there are two obvious reasons. One is that there was such a strong tradition of disease ecology in Australia because of Burnett, really, Macfarlane Burnett. And his work, as I say, he invented the term in 1936 in a paper, And then he went on to write in 1940 Biological Aspects of Infectious Diseases, which will certainly be a candidate for being the most influential monograph in 20th century biomedicine. Not that it's a genre that 20th century biomedicine favours, but and then he was involved. He influenced people on the east coast of the US, Zinsser and Dubos in particular, and then and Fenner, of course. And so there was this intellectual tradition, ecological tradition there. There was also, when I talked about the debate, the big debate in the mid-20th century population ecology was happening in Australia, in a sense, between Nicholson and Birch and Andrew Wather. So in animal ecology, Australia was also central. So why ecology? Well, our friends Tom Griffiths and Libby Robin have actually written about this, ecology as a science of settler colonialism or of empire more generally. And it does go back to Richard Grove, that wonderful book he wrote, Green Imperialism, where he actually says that this was the sort of the cutting edge, literally, of environmental degradation. And colonial, whether settler colonial or exploitative colonial authorities had to contend with the degradation of environments they did not understand at all. And so I think it was out of that sort of confrontation that ecological thought arose, even when it arose in places like Oxford, as Peter Anker has shown, or the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. It had colonial origins, ultimately, even when they were doing bringing people back to do the thinking in these places. So I think it is actually, it involves some sort of settler colonialism. One could think of the Scandinavian countries and the northern reaches and wonder why, despite the importance of various Stockholm conferences, why Scandinavia hasn't taken the lead in disease ecology and planetary health.
That's a very good question. I think we will have to return to that one. We have one more question over here, Mike, please.
Yeah, that was a great talk and full of ideas. But you just actually sort of came back to what I wanted to talk about, because at the very end of your talk, you ended on a political note, and which was suggesting that this kind of planetary environmental consciousness is part of a long durée of historical development of settler societies and imperialism. And obviously, there's a big infrastructural history that goes alongside the story of intellectual history of ideas about planetary consciousness and environmentalism. Planetary consciousness is also a result of organizations like League of Nations, international conferences, United Nations. There's a whole iconography of the globe, of the planet, lots of science fiction, fantasy, and stuff, even, say, the Martian Chronicles and terraforming Mars is a kind of utopian kind of corollary to the story that you tell. But what I want to sort of bring you to or think about, because I really don't know, is what kind of politics emerges out of this. I mean, obviously, if you're going to do something planetary, you need planetary institutions, you need planetary infrastructure. And I don't know that, I mean, all of the people who you mentioned seem to be kind of participating in it without kind of really theorizing what a global politics or planetary politics would entail. So I'm just wondering your thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I first should say that, just to clarify, I probably don't need to say it here, but I always need to say it in the United States, that the United States and Canada, of course, are settler colonial societies as well, so I'm including them within that category. But it's remarkable how rarely even the most progressive Americans know that. But anyhow, yes, I mean, this is actually a key problem, I think, for planetary health, and that is, what does one do now? I mean, what works? What will work? And I think it's been a problem that has caused many people in planetary health to turn to historians and say, what are the lessons of history? What does work? What has worked in the past? How have major public health changes taken place? And, I'm always uncomfortable about the lessons of history. I mean, the lesson of history is that there is no lesson of history, really. But in any case, I mean, it's perhaps a sign of desperation the turning to historians. But I think that at the very least, what this is doing is adding enormous rhetorical force to the people who want action, say, on climate change. Well, I suppose we all do. Those of us who want action on climate change and environmental degradation. Unfortunately, I mean, it's been criticised, the field's been criticised by people in One Health because it's so humanist, it's so anthropocentric. Well, that's true of all human medicine, obviously, but the very name suggests that. But I think that the advantage of it being so humanist and anthropocentric is that it makes it perhaps more understandable and appealing to people who don't really feel an attachment to saving an environment or even the whole planet. That is a problem. And I've as you know, I'm at Harvard, which is an institution heavily invested in a rather narrowly conceived view of global health. And most people are quite dismissive of planetary health. There's that little group in School of Public Health, whereas the whole of the Harvard School of Medicine is dedicated to global health. And people there say, we have these modular solutions. We can just come to any country and impose our solutions and clear up the disease and move out again in global health. Whereas what you're asking in planetary health is just so vast that it's never, at Harvard we would never really invest in it because it's not going to go anywhere. It's going to disappear.
You're taking the politics out. I mean, there's any kind of...
No, what I'm saying is that the politics are too hot because the politics are changing global capitalism. And that's what I'm saying. I'm not taking... It's Harvard that may be trying to avoid it because of the politics, but the politics are very pressing. But they're very ambitious, I think, and perhaps unachievable. But no, the politics are the problem in a way. Yeah.
All right. Yes, the politics are the problem. All right. One last question, Julia.
Thank you very much. I'm a young researcher here at Karolinska working with global health. And I noticed another bias within the foundation of planetary health. I'm not an expert of planetary health, but there was a lot of quotes from men. And I wonder if maybe the Scandinavian school had more, sexual and reproductive health and rights included. And because I feel, the worrying about overpopulation in global health, we would say that if you empower women and give the chance.
I'm glad you pointed that out. I was going to say a little bit at the very end about that, but I was running out of time, but also might have taken us in a different direction. I'm very glad you mentioned it. I noticed it particularly putting together the slides. One old white man after another, saying that as an old white man. And there's Barbara Ward, but Barbara Ward is not in any telling of the story a major influence on planetary health or in that sense, but on sustainable development, yes. If you're telling that story, you'd feature Barbara Ward. I actually think there's a politics to this as well, but it's not just related to disease ecology and planetary health. It's certainly related to biomedicine and also to global health. And that is that there's something about who feels he has the authority to make global claims. There's something about global claims making. I always remember a conversation debate between David Harvey and Ann Stoller at the American Anthropological Association, where he basically said, I do the global. I do global capitalism. And what you do is the intimate and the sentimental and the contact zones. And she responded quite vigorously about this, about how this is the assumption. This is why most theorists of globalization tend to be middle-aged males. And I think it's the same sort of thing here, where once you get to a position, who feels he has the authority to make global claims? I think this is a real problem with the field. Yeah. There are women in the field, but they're not the ones who are generally recognised anyhow as making global claims. Yeah.
Well, on that slightly depressing note, I think it's incredibly important issues that we have discussed here today, and I'm very grateful that you have come here all the way from Sydney via Boston to share your insights in this field. So now, once again, join me in thanking Warwick Anderson.